For decades, nuclear energy has been viewed with, well, suspicion. But these days, nuclear power is starting to look a lot more attractive.
France has the cheapest electricity in Europe and the lowest carbon intensity of any economy in Europe. So, that looks like a pretty good deal to me. My name is Ted Nordhaus. I'm the founder and executive director of the Breakthrough Institute. We focus on technological solutions to environmental problems.
Ted Nordhaus, along with co-author Giselle Lloyd, just published an article in Finance and Development magazine about how rising energy prices and the war in Ukraine have prompted many to rethink nuclear energy.
But, I think it was climate change going back over the last decade that sort of re-socializes nuclear for a lot of people who had just sort of airbrushed it out of the picture.
Journalist Rhoda Metcalf sat down with Ted Nordhaus to learn more about this so-called nuclear resurgence.
For years, there was a lot of fear and opposition to nuclear, but now it seems like its star is rising again. Can you lay the picture out for me? Where have we come from and where are we going when it comes to nuclear power?
Historically, nuclear energy was sort of viewed as an environmental bad. And much of the modern environmental movement was really born in opposition to nuclear energy. There was always a very strong conflation of nuclear weapons with nuclear energy, even though they're completely different technologies. And then through the 60s, early 70s, nuclear is understood to be sort of a tool of the ruling class, of the ruling industrial order. You have all the small is beautiful environmentalism. And, sort of all of that congeals around opposition to nuclear energy.
Right.
So fast forward 4 decades, and suddenly we have this climate change problem. And a whole set of folks start to kind of reconsider nuclear energy, because here you have this 24/7 source of electricity that doesn't produce any carbon emissions.
Right.
And has actually, if you kind of look back into the 60s, 70s, 80s, has a proven track record of actually deeply decarbonizing modern industrialized societies.
And then more recently, now in the current situation with the war in Ukraine, there's been sort of an extra bump in popularity, right?
Yeah. Well, some of that's because Europe and Germany in particular spent the last couple of decades trying to close all its nuclear plants. Even France, which has been the sort of great shining case for what was possible with nuclear energy, had set a goal of reducing its use of nuclear from 75% of its electrical sector to 50%. And there was all sorts of sort of hand-waving about how all of that was going to be replaced with wind and solar energies. And Europe has deployed a lot of wind and solar energy, but the dirty secret was that because those energy sources were intermittent, it actually made Europe much more dependent on natural gas.
Right.
And most of that gas was coming from Russia. Then, you get, even before the Ukraine war, as the world economy is coming out of the COVID pandemic, you're already having pretty significant energy shortages, a lot of it having to do with, that sort of gas production had kind of crashed when demand crashed during the pandemic, and then demand came back and the production wasn't there. So gas prices were already going through the roof. And so even in the fall before Ukraine, the UK says, we're going to get serious again about nuclear, which they've been on and off about. The French suddenly reversed course and are like, no, we're keeping our plants operating and we're going to build a bunch more of them. And then the Ukraine war hits, and obviously the consequences of that are immediately apparent. And even Germany finally, agrees that it's going to at least keep the 3 reactors it still has operating open longer. We'll see how much longer, but I think it really kind of points to the value of nuclear energy for both energy security and as a critical climate technology.
Right. So, what are the advantages of nuclear? Why are you such an enthusiast?
It's an amazing technology. It's energy dense. It's zero carbon. It has an extremely small land use footprint. It's extremely efficient in terms of critical minerals, steel, cement, all the other things that any kind of significant energy infrastructure requires. It is the safest energy technology in the world, despite 50 years of anti-nuclear environmental propaganda to the contrary.
But does that mean that there are no risks? I mean, leaks, storing the waste, the fear it could get into the wrong hands?
I mean, there are, if you dove into a fuel rod cooling pool 6 months after the rods have been pulled out of a reactor, you could get radiation exposures that could be quite significant. And high doses of radiation are dangerous. But low doses of radiation are really comparatively pretty insignificant health risks. We now have like 60 years of epidemiology going through decades of tracking, the health of people who worked at nuclear plants, going on to looking at exposures to radiation associated with medical interventions. I mean, everyone forgets that where most people will get the biggest doses of radiation in their life is nuclear medicine. It's MRIs and CAT scans and things like that. And at low doses, we now know pretty well that the risks are extremely limited.
All right. Okay. So what do you think nuclear would be replacing? Would nuclear power be replacing all of the power generating capacity of oil and gas? I mean, where do you see nuclear power fitting in?
So the first thing that it has historically displaced almost everywhere it's been deployed is coal and gas in the power sector. But nuclear also has a bunch of other attributes that make it very valuable for other things. And what's interesting is that they're much harder sectors of the economy to decarbonize. So if you look at things like refining or fertilizer manufacturing, those things, require direct heat.
Right.
Nuclear has a lot of advantages there because, again, it produces both heat and electricity. So there's a bunch of different applications outside of the power sector where nuclear is a really unique technology that can do a lot of the things that we need to do that it's difficult to use electricity for.
And how about the cost side? I mean, how does it compare?
Well, it depends on the context and it depends on the technology. So wind and solar are very, very cheap on the margins. With today's technology in a lot of places, if they have decent wind or solar resources, it can be quite cheap to get to, 20, 30 plus % of your electricity from those sources.
Right.
But once you go beyond that, the intermittency becomes a real problem.
Right, because it's not consistent because you don't have consistent wind, you don't have consistent
what do you
sun.
do when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining? You get periods in Europe, for instance, when you'll go weeks in the winter where there's very little, sunshine, and also where you get very little wind. You need to keep the lights on. You need to heat homes. And the way that Europe does that now is with coal and gas. So the key thing to understand about nuclear, is that at least with conventional nuclear, all of the costs are up front.
Yeah.
You're building like infrastructure that will operate or should operate for 80 years. So the sort of time horizons that you're looking at in terms of valuing the electricity that it produces are really, really different than a, solar panel that's going to get manufactured in China. You're going to kind of go put it on a rooftop or in a solar farm, and it's going to generate electricity for, say, 25 years. And then you're going to throw it in a waste dump somewhere. And meanwhile, you have a nuclear plant that's been generating electricity 24/7 for 25 years and will generate electricity for another 35 or 40 or 45 years. I think the important thing I would point out is that if you kind of look at the places that have done a lot of nuclear, for instance, France has the cheapest electricity in Europe and the lowest carbon intensity of any economy in Europe. So, that looks like a pretty good deal to me.
Right. But I mean, if you want to produce more nuclear energy, isn't there also the issue of the long time lag? As you mentioned earlier, there's this big upfront investment, and then it takes, 10, 20 years until you can get a new nuclear reactor actually up and running. I mean, when you're trying to fight urgent climate change, isn't that long time lag a problem?
Well, yes and no. I think there is a lot of phony deadlineism in the climate conversation. And a lot of it is used not just to kind of create a sense of urgency, but to take solutions off the table, nuclear being one of them. We don't have time. We have to cut emissions in half in 5 years or 10 years. Well, you don't have to be a climate scientist to conclude that that's not going to happen. So
what's not going to happen?
These sort of very rapid cuts in emissions.
Right.
So, it might take you a decade to deploy a nuclear plant, but, you're deploying it at a gigawatt at a time, and it's going to operate for 80 years, and it's going to operate 24/7. Now, when you haven't built a reactor in 30 years and you decide, well, let's build one and see how it goes, it's going to take a long time. It's going to cost a lot of money. But as you build more of them, like any sort of manufacturing, you learn, you have process innovation, you improve your supply chains, and costs come down. But you can't do that if you're not actually committed to building a lot of it.
Right.
And then the final piece is like, if we want more nuclear, we're going to have to kind of take a second look at the regulatory system, which is hugely burdensome. We don't regulate anything else like this. And you look at the next generation of small advanced reactors. I mean, these will literally be the safest energy technologies in the history of human societies and human technology.
Yeah, in fact, I wanted to ask you about how nuclear technology is changing. You mentioned in your article these new small nuclear reactors. I mean, how would they be used? And, just how big are they?
Right. So a large reactor, typical light water reactor, is 1 gigawatt of electricity every year.
Okay.
So small reactors are anywhere from as small as 1 to 2 megawatts. So 1,000 times smaller. And they can go up to 100 or 200 megawatts.
So if I understand you, it sounds like there's two types of new reactors coming down the pipe. The larger ones that use updated technology but are still, pretty big reactors. And then there's this other group of kind of mini reactors, right, that are really small.
Yes, in fact, they have tiny, tiny footprints that can be dropped in and then kind of pulled out. They're sealed. And so if you're like a poor country that wants the benefits of nuclear energy, I think in the coming decades, it's likely you'll be able to a private company will come, they'll drop it in, you'll plug it into the grid. It'll be just plug and play to your existing electrical grid. It'll be a reactor that only needs to be refueled every 5, 6, 10 years. And then they'll come back and they'll pull the whole reactor out, drop a new reactor in, and they'll take the old reactor back and they'll refurbish it and refuel it for reuse. And so the country that's being exported to will have no nuclear infrastructure whatsoever except for what's being dropped in and pulled out.
And how far away are we from actually seeing these smaller, it sounds fascinating, these small reactors. How far away are we from having that technology on the ground?
Well, so China has connected its first small advanced reactor, which is a gas-cooled reactor, to the grid, I think last year or the year before. NuScale, which is a U.S. company and is a small modular light water reactor, is planning to deploy its first units in 2026, 2027, something like that. And then the U.S. has provided a fair amount of money and made awards to for demonstrations of 2 advanced reactor technologies. But I do think it's reasonable that we will see sort of the first advanced reactors outside of China coming online by the end of this decade. And then from there, there's a question of how quickly can you scale it and get to the point where you're sort of producing multiples of these in factories. And, you're probably looking at the mid-2030s really before anyone's doing that.
All right. Just going back, finally, we're talking about how the war in Ukraine has renewed, to a certain extent, enthusiasm for nuclear power. When the war ends in the Ukraine, which hopefully will happen soon, do you think we're going to see a bit of a fall off in this nuclear popularity?
I don't think so. Fingers crossed that it ends in a acceptable fashion soon. But given what the world has just gone through, it's hard for me to see that you get to the other end of this and Europe is like, let's rebuild those Nord Stream pipelines and go back to business as usual. I think that, a lot of Europe is going to be like, yeah, nuclear definitely needs to be at least part of our mix. And I think especially in Eastern Europe, if you look at where a lot of the push across Europe was for nuclear, even before the Ukraine war, it was coming from Poland, it was coming from Romania, from a bunch of Eastern European countries that were quite clear that they did not want to be dependent upon Russian oil and gas, and that they didn't want to kind of bet their future on coal, given climate considerations. And I think, however the Ukraine war ends, I think those members are going to insist upon nuclear technology going forward.
Okay, well, that's great. So, Ted Nordhaus, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and breaking down some of these vital issues for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to do it.
That was Rhoda Metcalf speaking with Ted Nordhaus, founder and executive director of the Breakthrough Institute. Look for his article about the nuclear resurgence in the December edition of Finance and Development magazine. Check it out at imf.org/FND. And look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. I'm Bruce Edwards.
And I'm Rhoda Metcalf.
Thanks for listening.